The next person that we're going to hear from is Nora Barrows-Friedman, and she is a longtime independent journalist and who has been chronicling the ongoing assault on the Palestinian people. And one of the reasons that we wanted to bring her to this is that we've had a couple conversations before, and she's extraordinarily articulate, and also has thought deeply about issues of colonization. And then another reason is that so far, I mean, what we're trying to do today, or one of the things we're trying to do, is to sort of build some sort of structure where different people bring different, am I mixing metaphors or just making a bad one or the other? Where different people are bringing different building blocks to this particular structure. And I think that you bring a very important part to this. So anyway, the first question is, what are some of the patterns and examples of the dominant culture's paradigm that are revealed in a place like Palestine, and what are the similarities we see on this continent? I want to say one thing before, which is that I can't help but every day when I read about new settlements, so-called, or any of that what we're seeing is pretty, and we could have been reading newspapers 130 years ago or 180 years ago of that happening in, native North America. But the process of, we're just going to take this one little piece of ground, and then that's it forever, and then you can have the rest of the land as long as the winds blow and grass grows. And actually we also need this. And then we actually need this over here. And then there's one of you threw a rock at us, so now we need to take this. And the process just seems very similar to me, at least.
Yeah, it's like a carbon copy of what has been happening on this continent for so many hundreds of years. And I think in a place like Palestine, it's where political and environmental colonialism really merges. I think because there isn't like oil underneath the ground in Palestine, but there's water, for example. And there's a region, and then there's also like a regional access point for these Western imperialist powers to launch these wars of aggression around that region, or to store these incredibly massive amounts of weapons on that soil, or to produce an extraordinarily secretive amount of nuclear weapons. To have like an operating base, a client state in that part of the world for the US and for Europe is part of the political context. And then there's an environmental context, which is just like you said, it's like, these foreign settlers, it's a settler-colonialist society, just as this is founded on settler colonialism, where the indigenous people have been further pushed into these ghettos, surrounded by these imperialist forces. And the structures then, the physical structures of what that looks like is one of the most clearest examples of this paradigm that we think of. So, for example, all the settlement colonies, and there are hundreds, there's over 140 actual settlement blocks inside the occupied West Bank. And then there are hundreds of what we call outposts, which are like extensions of these settlement blocks that eventually connect with other settlement blocks. And it's like this spreading cancer all over the West Bank. So so that now communities are completely cut off from each other, and the hillsides have been literally chopped on the top. I mean, there's a hill I'm thinking about just outside of Bethlehem, where I'm based when I'm in Palestine. It was called Jabal Abu Ghneim, and now it's called Har Homa settlement, which means the mountain of wind, I believe, in Hebrew. And what they did in the 80s was this was a hillside that for countless amount of years, generations and generations, had been like a nature preserve, and it was one of the most kind of sacred spaces for Palestinians. And there were trees and flora and fauna that were endemic only to this hillside for so long. No one touched it. People went to have picnics and to celebrate the land. And then after 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were purged, and the settler-colonial state was established as Israel, and then subsequently the occupations came, and then after 1967 the settlements started popping up all over the occupied West Bank and in East Jerusalem. This hillside, the top of it was literally sheared off. All of the trees were cut down. You can't find one tree on this hillside anymore, and this fortress went up. And there are books on this, the architecture of occupation, the architecture of settler colonialism, where you'd think that these settlers, after winning this land so victoriously, as they like to purport, that they would be acting in concert with the land, that they would be so attached to this land as they say they are, that the structures that they would build to house themselves in would also look like they would be in concert. But no, because it's such a militarized system, these structures that they've built look like actual fortresses, and they're completely antithetical to the landscape. They sheared off the top of the mountain and then they built these square, massive, 10-story homes and apartment buildings. And they ring them around what's left of this hillside, so that there's the first kind of line of houses, and then there's the second one, so that they're staggered like this, so you really can't see any holes of space of land in between these houses, and they're looking down on the Palestinian villages in the valleys below. And then the way that the psychology of that is not lost on the people whose land that once was, it still is. That now that the indigenous are not only watching their land being erased and turned into military fortresses of power and of colonialism, but they're also such a foreboding and startling image just unto themselves, and they're being surrounded by these. When one goes, another pops up here, another pops up here. There are entire villages that are now surrounded entirely on all sides by these fortresses and by people who want to erase them.
In the first question was the phrase dominant cultural paradigm that we were saying that this was an example of, and what is the dominant cultural? Let's be explicit. What is that?
Dominant culture right now, in terms of the industry of colonialism in Palestine, is so exactly the same as it was here. I mean, this reasoning, this kind of Zionist narrative that has been invented, where this land is just for one people, where the Jews are the chosen people for this land only, and everyone else is just in the way. It's the manifest destiny narrative of what's happening here, what was established 500 years ago, and what continues to be operational here. And I think about this a lot, and it's it's so intrinsic to still how we feel about this place and what our children are taught about this place. And I just came back from Palestine just a little over a week ago, and My daughter, who's just about to be 10, she goes to this fantastic school in Oakland. They're very social justice oriented, but still, there are like these channels of the dominant culture narrative that are so endemic to education. And she's learning now about the gold rush. And next week I'm chaperoning this field trip up north, and we're going to be learning about the history of how this state was founded on such a capitalist land grab and resource steal, just like what's happening in Palestine. The land is being gobbled up by foreigners. And she came home with a sheet, a couple pages worth of lyrics of some songs that they've been singing and learning in class. And I wrote down some of the lyrics, and just listen to this. That gold was here for me to find. This is one of the lyrics that is in this song. Another one was, I got the itch to strike it rich. And I was like shocked that this is still the narrative that's being promoted in even a school that's so, Bay Area hippie, social justice, everybody loves each other kind of, they talk about, they don't say Columbus Day, for example. They do celebrate Indigenous Cultures Day. But still, there's this dominant culture narrative that is like a poison, and it's almost impossible to dislocate it. And I talked to her about that. I was like, we really have to understand what we're saying. What do you mean this gold was here for me to find? Whose gold is it? Why, in Iraq, why is our oil under their sand? It's the same exact. Why in Palestine is this land just for one people? Because it's in a book that someone wrote, as if God was a real estate agent. Why do we accept these narratives still? And why is the dominant culture a culture that is built on destruction and death and violence and taking and not giving? Why is that still the accepted culture? Why are we still putting up with this? And so that's, when I go to Palestine and I see these hillsides being chopped to pieces, when I see these settlers attacking children. Just the other day, a settler ran over a child in East Jerusalem with his car, a deliberate attack. 2 days ago in Hebron, in the southern occupied West Bank, a settler tried to abduct a 3-year-old toddler, Palestinian toddler, for part of this price tag policy. Because in September, a couple of resistance activists decided they would ambush a car full of settlers on an illegal settler bypass road going into an illegal settler colony in Hebron, that they would attack a car. And they did, and they killed 3 settlers. And now there's been this price tag reprisal policy all over the West Bank for the last month and a half, where settlers are trying to abduct children and running over kids in their cars, and no one's stepping in. And so it's like this constant drone of, that's acceptable. What Palestinians did, to ambush that car was not acceptable. But settlers running over a kid in their car is acceptable. Settlers taking the land of somebody is acceptable. And to fight back against that dominant culture paradigm is incomprehensible. Just like how Native people here, to fight back against the continued theft of their land and the continued marginalization of their communities is not acceptable. They should be happy with what we've given them.
And it's very much it's a very heavy burden that we white people carry to civilize them all too.
Yeah. Yeah, they should be so lucky.
I know. Damn ingrates. So how does the whole colonial structure affect people's connection to the land base? And also you've used the word we, and here, how does the colonial structure affect people's connection? I think we have at least 2 different sets of people to talk about here.
Yeah.
With the actually more than 2 sets. We have the colonizers, the settlers, How does it affect their relationship with the land base? How does it affect the dispossessed? And how does it affect those who remain but are subjugated?
Yeah, well, okay, so let's take the first one. So how does it affect the settlers who are who are doing this and taking that land? I think it's turned it from this relationship of guardianship of the land, of kind of this mystical, biblical, if you want to do that, attachment to it, where this is the land of my people, and my people were driven out, and we were able to come back, and isn't this fantastic? Because of this now possessive quality, like a militant possessive quality of no one else but me is allowed here, and so settlers now are mandated to carry weapons with them, that they are protected by the fourth largest military in the world at their behest, that they are given the encouragement by the state that has driven these policies into entrenchment, to go and take over Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem, which is happening almost on a daily basis now. That it really has, in fact, disaligned themselves, disconnected them as a community, and I'm being general because I have to be, from that actual relationship and connection and love for the land. So the land becomes then a commodity with which to bargain their own hierarchy and their own supremacy, where they can feel okay about cutting off the top of a mountain and drying up rivers to make their fortress-like structures. For the people who have been dispossessed from that land for the last 62 years, there are 6 million dispossessed Palestinians in the global diaspora now. It's the largest and ongoing refugee community in the world and in modern history. It's also become kind of a mythical place when Palestinians who haven't been back since 1948, or for Palestinians who live here, when they talk about their land, it's like they go off. I mean, I've done so many interviews and so many kind of oral history projects with people who are in refugee camps who are literally 20 minutes away from their land, which is now in ruins or has been turned into some Israeli community. And they go off in their imagination as though they were there, as though they still remember what the house looked like and where you turned on a certain road to get your bread from the baker, and what the school looked like, and the smell of the trees in the fall. And it becomes this place of mythic proportions. And that place, there are 531 villages that were destroyed from 1948 until 1951 and 52. And but the ghosts and the memories of those villages are still alive, and it's like a wrenching emotion that happened when you talked, especially to the oldest generation who remembers these things very, very personally and very vividly. All they wanted, I remember talking to this one elder in this one refugee camp who's now in his 80s, and he says, all I want to do is die and have my bones buried in my land. That's all. And he knows that his land in this village that's just 25 minutes away from where he was standing is now, under the heap of a huge forest that was planted by the Jewish National Fund, this greenwashing industry that came in to literally erase and cover up the crimes of this colonial project in 1948. He knew that it was not there as he would have as he would not recognize it if he were there today. So it becomes also this figment of one's imagination, and this collective figment of imagination. And then for the people who are living under that subjugation, it's not the only. It's a major driving force in why they still are there and why they haven't left yet.
A couple of things. One of them is I interviewed Vine Deloria maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago. And he was saying that it is a crucial time for many of them, for at least the Plains Indians, because he was saying that that many of the last of the people who were born unconquered or born undispossessed or born free, as he put it, they died in the 1930s, and so the last people who had ever spoken to any of the people who had been born still under their traditional, I'm hesitating to use unconquered because in many ways they haven't been conquered, but I'll use his term. The last people who would ever talk to the people who had been born free were still alive. And I'm thinking about that, as you say, of the older people who were living 20 miles away from. So, I mean, if you have anything to say to that, then do. If not, I'll go on to the next question.
Yeah. I mean, indigenous communities all over the world have a different relationship to the land, a relationship that we don't understand and we can't, we haven't grown up with in that collective way. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, and I think for the colonizers, still from today, they've seen that as a sign of weakness. That if you have this romance with a land, then you're easily conquerable, and in the older generation that I speak with when I'm in Palestine, they are the most unconquered people. They were the ones who, walked, not drove, but walked with all of their possessions on their backs for miles and days. So, some of them went to Lebanon and to Syria and Jordan. Some of them ended up in Gaza. A lot of them ended up in the West Bank. Many went overseas. They were driven out, and yet they're exactly the same people inherently who they were 62 years ago, still with the same attachment. I mean, that you could, like this old man that was saying, all I want is for my bones to be buried there. There's such reverence in that. And the fact that there are now these foreigners who have come in and ruined his land and planted these trees. I mean, I don't know what my point is, but there's this there was such a, I don't know, there's this way in which the resilience was underestimated by the colonizers. They really thought, the early colonizers of the 1940s thought that they could drive everybody out and the Palestinians would find somewhere else to live, and they'd be happy in another Arab country. And they still say this. Well, they can go to Jordan. What's the difference? They speak Arabic there, they're Muslim there, Christians there. But they underestimated the stubbornness of that attachment to the land, and the stubbornness of people who still have that history inside of them. And the same, you can find that here, you can find that anywhere in the world.
So how do people resist? And is resistance possible?
How do people resist? I think in that stubbornness, there's resistance. I think in not giving up and not giving in. I think there's this great line in a documentary that I recently saw about Gaza, and it was made in the days after the massacres in 2008 and 2009, when 1,400 Palestinians, including about 400 children, were killed in a 22-day bombing strike. And this man, I wrote it down because it's just beautiful. He said, he was a farmer, and he's looking at his wheat field and his strawberry field that was completely obliterated by bombs, and now there's still landmines and he can't go to his field. And he said, "I love to feed all who inhabit this earth. I make soldiers out of wheat stalks." That is particularly poignant, I think, and it's very reflective of how people like the Palestinians have been able to survive. And I think that there's also inherent in that is this relationship with the land, and the land itself is resisting. And there's this incredible article I read that was talking about the trees. Remember I mentioned the trees that the Jewish National Fund had been planting to cover up the crimes of the ethnic cleansing program. And those trees, they're pine trees and cypress trees that were actually imported from other Mediterranean countries. So they weren't native species. I mean, the whole thing is such a huge metaphor, right? So they came over on boats with these trees, and they planted them. And here in the States, you could plant a tree for Israel, and all these, boxes at every synagogue. I remember doing that as a kid too. You put a quarter in the box, you plant a tree for Israel. It was this whole green washing, very environmentally focused industry to move the native people and the native species out. Well, these trees that are now 60 odd years old are actually suffering a major disease problem right now because they're not endemic species, and they're dying out. And actually, the old endemic species are coming back in. There are this cactus, sabra, that's like native to the Mediterranean coast. And before settler-colonialism era, Palestinian farmers used to delineate their farms with these cactus, and that was kind of boundaries and borders for livestock and all this. Well, now these sabra are actually coming back up, and they're actually taking over some of the trees again. And I think there's a lot of solace in that. I think that we also forget that nature is also going to take care, that these species that have been wiped out or have been, there have been these efforts to wipe them out, that they're also stubborn as the people. So that's resistance. I think that you can look at political and militant resistance also in Palestinian society, and they've tried everything. Some of it's worked, some of it hasn't worked. But I think people aren't ready to give up either way. I think there's a lot of resistance. I think a lot of people are being tenacious and are trying to learn as much as they can about previous struggles around the world. A good friend of mine who's 23 years old, this kid who's just absolutely brilliant. He's an expert on Algerian resistance, and he's an expert on the resistance here, of native resistance in this soil. And it's So I think resistance also has a lot to do with stubbornness, and I think we have a lot to learn about that.
Well, I like what you're saying, but I'm thinking maybe everything that we're talking about here today is kind of crap. Because I was talking about that technotopian that I had the sort of aborted dialogue with. One of the things he was talking about, because we actually had a different conversation than the one that he got TKO'd on. And one of the things he said was that people all over the world really want to live the way, everybody wants to live the way people in the United States live. And we got these really cool computers. We got iPods, cell phones. We have basically anything we want except a cancer-free existence on a living planet. And so this actually brings up the whole white man's burden joke. I mean, he actually was pushing the white man's burden. I was pretty, I wanted to call him Rudyard and just get it over with. But so, you know, basically what are the Palestinians complaining about? Because aren't Israelis bringing in industry? Aren't they bringing in jobs? I mean, don't they actually improve standard of living? I mean, what's the problem?
Yeah, right. We call this the happy slave mentality. I think that's what industrialized capitalism is all about. Is promoting an idea that your life can be better if you have these things. So Palestinians, their lives are so much better because they can get a permission slip from the Israeli government saying that they can work inside an Israeli settlement and provide food for their family. Their life is much better, right? Their lives are much. The Jewish Zionist colonists, they made the desert bloom. It was a desert before they came. You know, this whole narrative of like, well, they brought industry and agriculture techniques to a people that had no idea how to grow vegetables.
Like riding camels.
Right, exactly. Backwards, barbaric people. So aren't they so lucky? It misses the point. And then if you distract the rest of the world with that, well, Palestinians in Israel, the 20% of the population, they get to vote. I mean, hey, that's democracy, right? They get to hold public office. Well, sure, they don't have the same school system, and they don't get the same water resources, and they don't get the same, privileges that the Jewish Israeli community has. But we'll let them have their communities. We'll let them have their public office. Aren't they lucky? What are they complaining about? And I think it's the same here. It's like, well, we have our iPods. Yeah, sure, okay, we get cancer, and we have this sea that's just been poisoned for the rest of our lives, and for our grandchildren and their grandchildren's lives. But we get cars. We should thank the industrialized capitalists.
Well, this is a really old narrative, and I mean it's certainly biblical.
Yeah.
And in North America, there's a great line by Captain John Chester who said that the natives would receive the riches of our faith, while the Europeans would take the materials of the forest.
That's right.
And a pro-slavery philosopher from 1830 wrote of how the slaves were actually ennobled by their contact with the superior minds of the slave owners.
That's right.
And if we could, I would really like to try to debunk that, because we can both sit here and make fun of it.
Right.
But the fact is that within a capitalist, colonialist structure, and insofar as you've been colonialized by a capitalist, colonialist mindset, that does become what you value. And one of the ways I put this in one of my books, which doesn't debunk it, it just continues to make fun of it, is that if I'm going to be in a prison, I would rather be a trustee than one of the lower level prisoners. You know, I'd rather not be in a prison at all, but I mean, unless it's got some good cars and nice health care. I mean, so what?
So, I mean, I think that's debunked every day, though. I think in Palestine that's debunked in the fact that, you know, there's over 50 refugee camps, and these refugee camps are not paradises. They're not by any means. They're, you know, in this one refugee camp that I have been based in since 2005, in Bethlehem, there are 12,000 people in half a square kilometer. And people are packed. I mean, you don't know what packed is. Packed is packed. You know, living on top of each other. If your neighbor sneezes, you know, the guy across the street, you know, 10 houses down can hear you. There's no privacy. Everyone's in everybody's business. There's no places for children to play. It's the Israeli military comes in still every single night and rounds people up. These are, you know, there was up until just a few years ago open trench sewers. Between 1948 and 1953, everyone was in canvas tents, and then in 1953 until the mid-70s, people were in these asbestos-filled 8x8 shacks where there are 25 families to one bathroom. You know, and now it's like this huge entire city. But the fact that there's 12,000 people in that one refugee camp living in one of the, you know, worst humanitarian living conditions, in a place that 20 minutes across the Green Line, people are living in the lap of luxury and swimming pools, and there's settlements, you know. The fact that there are still people there, and they haven't moved outside of the refugee camp, because they could, and people have, but the vast majority still believes that their identity as Palestinians who have been dispossessed is intrinsic to the resistance. And they haven't moved, and they won't. And when people ask, you know, when you go into the refugee camp and you say, hey, you know, what's your name? Where are you from? You know, people don't say I'm from Dahesh camp. They say I'm from, you know, such and such village. My family's from this village. A 2-year-old kid knows which villages his great-grandparents were dispossessed from. And that is a tool against the colonialist structure. They could get permission. Another friend of mine, for example, she needs to go to the American consulate in East Jerusalem. But to go to the American consulate in East Jerusalem to get her passport to leave the country, she would have to get, by all intents and purposes, permission from the Israeli District Coordinating Office in the adjacent settlement colony block in Bethlehem to then apply for permission to leave Bethlehem, to go across the checkpoint, to go to Jerusalem to get her permission slip to leave the country, right? So she has decided for the last 6 years not to get permission. She will not get permission. She finds ways, and there are ways, to get across that goddamn checkpoint without having to appeal for permission from the colonizers who hold that artificial, in all intents and purposes, bureaucratic stranglehold of a paradigm over these occupied people. So she, as a measure of her own tenacity and her, you know, militant refusal to be a part of that system, to be subjugated by a piece of paper, to say when she can go to her land, which is right next to Jerusalem, that, you know, her parents can't go to, to refuse to be part of that system is refusing also the tenets of colonialism.
So how does that apply to us?
That's a really good question. How does that apply to us? I think being willing to take responsibility. I think, for example, for me as a 100% Jewish woman who has an American passport, an American citizenship, I have, in this ridiculous accident of birth, have become a very privileged person when I go to Palestine. I don't get searched at the airport. I don't get harassed and detained at checkpoints. I can show my passport like this, and I'm let through. Wherever I want to go, that's where I am. And there's a privilege that I didn't ask for, but which has become a tool now for, politically subversive information about what's happening there on the ground to these people that nobody wants to hear from. I think to be able to be vehicles for information exchange, to use, like as my child's preschool teacher once said, to use your powers for good. I think we can't be consumed with so much like white man's burden. I think white man's burden and guilt are actually really useless constructs in your mind, because they just kind of weigh on you instead of you using that accident of birth to do good change in this world and to inform other people about what's happening and to be vehicles of that, exchange of thought. That's responsibility that we have, and as a Jewish American passport holder in Palestine, I shouldn't cry about, oh, it's so sad, I have all this privilege. What does that do?
Yeah, I think, as a white male, I've thought about this a little bit, and I think that part of my responsibility as someone who has gained this unearned privilege is to use this privilege to undercut its basis.
Exactly. And if we give it so much power, like, oh God, I have so much privilege, and whine about it and cry about it, I think that also builds it up even more. And we have to undermine it. We have to undercut it.
So we've been talking about Palestine. We haven't been talking about journalism. And
Derek, we haven't talked.
okay. Well, we'll talk about journalism for just a second.
Okay.
And people can lump lunch. And anyway, what I wanted to say, because I think this is just really important. So, the journalists are always told to tell both sides of a conflict, unless of course you're talking about crime, in which case there's only one side.
Right.
To be objective, which always strikes me as stupid because I'm not an object, so I'm not objective.
Exactly.
But there's always two sides to a story. There is BP's side, and then there is Noah's side.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then there's the actual real side, which. But how does one, as a, let's not use the word objective, let's use the word neutrality. Where does all this fit in? Frankly, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
Why would I write something unless I have an opinion?
Right.
And the point I try to make in Endgame again and again is that all writing is propaganda, and that even if I'm attempting to not have an opinion, if I'm writing, okay, so the cops shot this criminal who was shooting a bank executive, it's like, well, wait a second, I could also say that the vigilantes shot the hero who was shooting the real criminal. So just your choice of language is going to, so how does this fit into any of your own work?
I think language is incredibly important. And I think especially in covering a story like Palestine or covering stories like BP. Objectivity is such a disservice to people. This myth of objectivity, as you said, like, we're not objects. We are inherently biased because we're human beings who feel and who have opinions, and that's okay as a journalist. It would. I mean, I've run into this so many times where there are journalists who are stenographers. That's all they do. They're stenographers for the dominant culture because they feel like that's the most, that's the platform that we should all aspire to as information, disseminators. Whereas there is a motive, there's an objective within the dominant culture to feed their own bias, which is one of destruction and killing and violence and uprootedness of culture and capitalism and imperialism and keeping these structures in place. That's their bias. They are very not objective in that construct. And the fact that journalists and writers and thinkers and philosophers and educators have been told to present both sides when we're not talking about a situation that's like this. It's this. For the narrative of what's happening in Palestine, everybody knows what Israel is. Everybody knows about Israel's struggle and the pain and the suffering, and everybody knows. Nobody knows about the causality of that narrative and what Palestinians have been struggling against. People don't know that, and when we are asked or tasked with this this notion that to be a professional journalist or to be a good writer, you should present both sides. I think that's incredibly destructive, actually, because if I go to Gaza, for example, and which I've done, and I go to the hospital, which only has this much anesthesia left on its shelves during the height of this blockade against Gaza as collective punishment for choosing the wrong people in one of the most free and fair democratic elections in the Middle East in decades, slapped with an economic blockade. Also, there is a list of banned items, and on the top of that list of the medication side was anesthesia. Right. So this notion that the Palestinians should now feel as much pain as possible for choosing the wrong people in a free and fair democratic election. That's not a metaphor, that's not hyperbole, that was actually literal policy because of what I saw on these shelves and because of the fact that these doctors now couldn't provide pain-free surgeries. And this was before the massacres took place, so you can only imagine what wartime trauma was like. If I was in that hospital and I was seeing what was going on with little anesthesia and bombs dropping everywhere, and I was just not, well, Israeli military said that there was a target, so that must be what it is, that there was a target on top of this hospital, so that's why they had to bomb it. What a disservice. What a way to be completely unaccountable to the people you're reporting on. I think when we write and when we think and when we educate, we have to think about who we're being accountable for. I think in journalism, especially wartime journalism, the people who are the ones under the thumb of whatever occupation or regime or violent militaristic paradigm and policies are the ones that undoubtedly we should be the one accountable towards, because those are the ones who we're not hearing from or about. Those are the ones who have been marginalized. Those are the ones who have been made into demons and subhumans so that we don't feel anything for them. Or and I'm going to end with this. There was this one this one story during the bombings of Gaza. There's this one zoo in Rafah, in the very southern part of the Gaza Strip. And the Israelis targeted the zoo, and there were all of these animals. Apparently, no birds, because the birds had all left. And for months afterwards, actually, the birds, friends of mine said that there were no birds in the trees in Rafah, in Gaza. They had all left. They could go. The birds could go. There were these ostriches, and I think a lion or two, who were running through the streets of Rafah after the bombing. Also, they had nowhere to go. They didn't have wings. They couldn't fly out. Eventually, they died. And I think that if we're not accountable to the people and the plants and the animals who are asking us to recognize them and their stories, I think that we've done an incredible disservice to this planet and to this feeling that we have as collective members of this world at this time, that we can change something.
Okay, we are going to do lunch until, what time is it now?